I've lived near the marsh for getting on for 35 years, and I've been involved in various bits of stuff on the marsh for about 20 years. I'm not an expert on anything, but I'm the sort of person who sort of runs around in the background, editing, planning submissions and helping to plant trees. These plane trees, this absolutely magnificent avenue, which, you know, as you walk along, it's one of the sights of the marsh, I think. These were planted, I believe, 1890 or just after. 1890 was the date when the newly created London County Council was put in charge of Hackney Marshes. They planted London planes and some other trees, limes and black poplars, along the edges of the marsh. We're now going to cross onto the main marsh. Sorry about speeding away, I get a bit overexcited. I mean, you can see it kind of falls into two kinds of landscape, with the football fields in the middle, and rugby and cricket pitches, and then round the edge, the trees. At the time that the GLC was abolished by Margaret Thatcher, the GLC had its own tree nursery, and they obviously had to close down, and they said, where are we going to put the trees? And they thought, oh, Hackney Marsh. So these are good GLC socialist trees, and they're planted in a crescent, so we call it crescent wood. There are a couple of places on the marsh where the land dips to its original level, and I'm planning to show you both of them. The first one is down here, by crescent wood. I'll not go quite so fast because it's unsociable. Originally, all the land here would have been down at this level. There you go. We dip down by crescent wood and come up again. Crescent wood dates back to, as I said, to 84. Behind you is a little wood of yew trees. Does anybody remember the Millennium Yew project? So there was this thing where lots of yew trees were given out for the millennium because they could be planted, and then in 1,000 years' time, people can see these yew trees which were planted 1,000 years ago. There were a lot of surplus yews buzzing around the London boroughs. And so Hackney had quite a few on its hands, so it planted this wood. As you can see, they're quite closely planted. It's more a sort of three-dimensional hedge than a woodland. What happened, they once they'd grown up to sort of 8 feet or so, what happened is that people came and started living in there because it was a dense, protected space, and quite a few people live on the marsh, Wick Woodland and other wild bits around the marsh, especially since the housing situation got so bad. The council then went and chopped off all the lower branches of the yew trees so that they could see all the way through, in order to discourage the rough campers. So very Hackney occurrence, really, but also kind of a symptom of how officialdom sometimes gets tree frenzies and ends up with more trees that it knows what to do with, which is rather different from how we approach tree planting. We just soldier on. This is a filter bed, so where London's wastewater was cleaned, the water would be filtered and then would be pumped off up to the reservoirs a couple of miles up the Lee Valley. And London's water supply is a hugely significant part of the history of the River Lee and the Lee Valley. If you looked at a map, you'll see there's reservoirs all the way up the Lee. And these filter beds were in use until the 1960s. I was born in 1954, and it sort of amazes me slightly to think that this was, in my living memory, technically this was in use, because now it looks as if it's been unused for a long time. And when it stopped being used, it made itself into a wildlife habitat. Reeds moved in, trees moved in. You can see willow and aspen, poplar, trees which like damp, ash which will just settle in anywhere as soon as you turn your back. I'm not quite sure, in the 70s, 80s, it started being managed officially as a reserve, which is what it now is. And as you can see, it's rather magical and very representative of the kind of the post-industrial look of this part of the Lee Valley, and much of the Lee Valley actually. Sometimes the water level has been significantly watery, like there's water with reeds sticking up through it, but I haven't seen it like that for a couple of years. So this is the point at which the Hackney Cut on that side of the marsh splits off from the old River Lee, which runs in it more or less its original course down this side of the marsh. And as you can see, here at least, there's a weir just there, but of course the cut is maintained at the level of its embankments in order to be navigable. This is allowed to run at its original level. The cut was built in the 1760s. Thank you. Yeah, I've been on Wikipedia a bit too, and there was always competition for the use of the Lee as transport and as power. All the way up the Lee Valley there are mills, and that's water mills doing various different things. Just across the river, or a little bit down the river, is Temple Mills, which is now railway yards, but it's Temple Mills because it was owned originally by the Knights Templar, and there was a lead mill there. Lead was ground for pigments, so it had to be oxidised in urine and cow dung. So you could imagine what went into the river from that little lot. You can see here, this inlet, this is the remains of a mill race which ran originally across the island down here, and there would have been a mill on that mill race taking water power from it. A mill race is where the water of a watercourse is channeled in order to provide power for a water wheel. There were lots of metal processing up the Lee. There was further up the Lee, but on Walthamstow Marshes, there's Copper Mill Lane where there were copper mills. They produced penny blanks, which went to towns in the days when individual boroughs were allowed to mint their own pennies. The Lee is not very industrial any longer. The last bits of industry along this part of the Lee were the wood yards just north of Lea Bridge Road, which closed down about 20 years ago. So as you can see, the water's pretty high today. It's racing along, and will be going off down eventually to the Thames. Tide on the Thames could be seen coming up to this point until just before 2012, because one of the things that was done to tidy the Lee up for the Olympics was that a dam was built, barrage, lower down at 3 Mills, because when the tide went down there were unsightly mud flats, and if you're trying to sell flats, expensive flats at the Olympic Village after the Olympics, you don't really want to see mud flats. This is no longer tidal, and it's a real shame. I miss it. I miss being able to see the tide coming in. I've stopped here really for a little bit of a chat about the recent political history of the marsh. Looking south, you can see the skyline. You can see the skyline. None of those buildings were there before the Olympics. that skyline used to be green. London got the Olympics in 2005, and after that, well, there were lots of repercussions for us. Various people had to be kicked out of the Olympic enclave, including some travellers who were rehoused on a site down in the southeast corner. It's very nice, but kind of rehousing people on a floodplain is maybe not the most sensible approach. And of course it's metropolitan open land, common land, but so maybe something better could have been done. The council said it was going to have a sports development programme for the marshes. In fact, it said it was going to have an everything development programme for the marshes to make it really great by the time of the Olympics, but there was a big emphasis on sports. And so down the far end you can see you can just see the red steel of the Hackney Marshes Centre, which was built. There used to be a smaller and more discreet football changing rooms building set back in the trees, and they decided they wanted something a bit more prestigious. I really quite like it. The footballers didn't like it because they said they had fewer changing rooms than in the old tatty old place. But the council can make money from it for parties and stuff. So, and that one of the constant pressures on political pressures on councils and green space these days is to make money from green space. The cricketing authorities, the Teston County Cricket Board, together with Sport England, came and said we'd really like to put some cricket pitches on the marshes. The council said, great, yeah, that would be terrific. So we got these new cricket pitches. We fended off having a cricket pitch put on the meadow, which is part of the Metropolitan Sink. So the cricket pitches went in before 2012, and a new pavilion was built over there. That wasn't been built until 2016. So the new cricket building, the old one changing rooms was a horrible eyesore, which I hated. This one is actually quite nice, and the council, as you can see, have planted on the marsh side of it, and that's growing up quite nicely. So I don't feel very strongly about it. Some people are really fed up of having two visible buildings straddling the marsh. Depends on your point of view. I mean, I quite like watching cricket and football, much more than the elite versions. So we got all this development on the marsh. We also got council saying we're going to plant lots of trees, and we said, well, we've been planting lots of trees and we're going to carry on, and if you just let us, we'll plant, X number of trees a year. They said, no, we're bringing contractors. And we said, well, we'll work with the contractors, and they said, no, it's much too dangerous for you to work with our tree planting contractors. Despite the fact that we've been working perfectly safely with volunteers for a couple of decades. So we were kicked off the marsh for tree planting for nearly 10 years. And the contractors came in and did various really quite weird things, like this little thicket over here, which is planted exactly on a grid. If you look very closely, the trees are in a squared off grid because the planters were following a map which had stippling on it, wide stippling to indicate the area, and they were carefully planting on each of the dots of the stippling. Which they explained to me. And further down we can see some other stuff. So all this excitement went on, and then even more exciting, we got the 2012 Radio 1 free festival on the Marshes. The Radio 1 does this somewhere every year, and we got an extra big version of it with 6 stages instead of the usual 3 or 4. At which point every single marsh stakeholder rose up in revolt and said you're joking. And the most effective thing was that Sport England came in and said, you're not having any more money, we're not going to give you the money for the new pavilion, stop messing us about. And it was interesting, it was an example, I mean it was stupid, but it was an example of the multiple pressures on a green space like this.